A poor boy sat trembling in court, accused of stealing genius he swore was his own. The wealthy school demanded millions. The jury was ready to condemn him until the doors opened and Keanu Reeves walked in. What he revealed next left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The wooden doors of the courthouse closed with a heavy thud, sealing in a silence that felt colder than the air-conditioned chill creeping through the room. At the defendant's table sat a boy who looked too young for the place, his thin shoulders swallowed by a jacket that was one size too big. 14-year-old Diego Morales kept his eyes fixed on the scratched surface of the table, his dark hair falling forward to hide the worry carved into his face. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to press them flat against the table, as if pinning down the fear rising in his chest. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be preparing for his next math exam, dreaming of one day earning a scholarship that could change his family's life. Instead, Diego now faced the weight of a courtroom where everything was stacked against him. The plaintiff's side was full of polished suits, polished shoes, and polished arrogance. At the center of it all stood Richard Blackwell, a man whose reputation stretched across the city. His hair was silver and perfect, his eyes sharp like a hawk's, his mouth twisted into something between a smile and a sneer. Blackwell had spent decades crushing opponents in court, but today his target was not another corporation or millionaire. His target was a boy. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, studying Diego like a predator waiting for the moment to strike. Every now and then, he adjusted his cufflinks, glinting gold under the Potter lights, as though to remind the room of the wealth and power behind him. The prestigious private school he represented had money, influence, and corporate sponsors who demanded that no one tarnish their reputation. Across the room, Diego's lawyer shuffled nervously through papers that seemed to slip from his grip no matter how tightly he held them. Kevin Dawson was fresh out of law school, barely older than Diego's older cousins, and this was his first case that carried any real consequence. His tie was slightly crooked, his forehead already damp with sweat, and every time he glanced toward Blackwell, he looked like a student caught unprepared by a ruthless teacher. Diego knew Kevin was trying his best, but best wasn't enough here. Not against Richard Blackwell. Not in a courtroom where truth didn't shine as brightly as money. Behind Diego, a handful of curious onlookers filled the benches. Some whispered about the absurdity of the case. Others shook their heads, but no one stood up for him. Maria Morales worked as a janitor at a downtown hotel, scrubbing floors until her knees ached and her hands cracked from the cleaning chemicals. If she missed a shift, she risked losing the job that kept a roof over their heads. So Diego sat alone against the wealth of a school that wanted to brand him a thief. Alone against lawyers who insisted his brilliance was nothing more than stolen work. Alone under the gaze of a judge who had not yet entered the room, but whose empty chair loomed like a throne, promising a verdict that could shatter his future. Diego's stomach tightened. His scholarship dreams already felt like ashes. His mother's sacrifices felt at risk of being mocked and erased. And still, he couldn't understand why doing the right thing, solving a problem with his own mind, had brought him here. The creak of the bailiff's footsteps broke the heavy silence. A call echoed through the room, steady and formal, announcing the arrival of the judge. Diego sat straighter, though his body felt heavy, as if the weight of the accusation pinned him down. The audience rose, then sat again when the judge entered. Judge Margaret Holloway settled into her seat, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. She was known for her discipline and her unwillingness to bend under influence, but Diego saw no warmth in her expression. She carried the dignity of years in law, her black robe perfectly pressed, her hair pulled back tight. She looked at Diego, at Blackwell, and at the crowd, then gave a small nod for the proceedings to begin. Richard Blackwell rose first. His voice was smooth, practiced, every word rolling like it had been rehearsed 100 times. He spoke of integrity, of the prestige of Harrington Prep, of how their intellectual property had been compromised. He painted Diego not as a boy, but as a deceiver, a thief clever enough to disguise plagiarism as brilliance. His words carried weight, echoing in the high-ceiling chamber, and Diego felt smaller with each passing sentence. When Blackwell motioned to the large folders his assistants carried, Diego's heart pounded faster. They laid diagrams and research papers on the table, all stamped with the crest of Harrington Prep. "This," Blackwell declared, pointing to the lines of equations and formulas, "is the work that Mr. Morales claims as his own, work that took years for our academy to refine. He would have you believe he discovered this independently, but the similarities are undeniable. He cheated. He embarrassed our institution. He tried to tarnish excellence with dishonesty." The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Diego wanted to shout that it wasn't true, that he had never even seen those papers, but his throat tightened. His lawyer scribbled notes, flipping through his own thin folder, searching desperately for something to use. Kevin Dawson stood, his chair scraping awkwardly against the floor. His voice cracked slightly as he introduced himself and stated Diego's innocence. He tried to explain that Diego's methods were original, that he had simply approached the problem with a unique perspective. But his words lacked the sharpness Blackwell's carried. His sentences tangled, his argument stumbling over itself. Each time he looked back at Diego for reassurance, Diego lowered his eyes, not wanting to see the doubt flickering there. Judge Holloway listened without interruption. But Diego noticed how her pen tapped against the desk in a slow rhythm. Impatience. Doubt. Maybe both. Blackwell leaned against the plaintiff's table with casual confidence, watching Kevin flounder. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a performance. And Blackwell knew the audience already leaned his way. Diego pressed his palms tighter against the table, his knuckles turning white. He had solved that problem on his own. He had stayed up late at the kitchen table, scribbling formulas under the dim light, while his mother cleaned nearby with the smell of bleach lingering in the air. None of that was in the documents spread out before him. But how could he prove it? How could a boy prove truth against the voice of a man like Blackwell? The thought hit him hard. Maybe he couldn't. The judge adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat, breaking the tension. "Mr. Dawson, please continue," she said, though her tone carried little patience. Kevin glanced at his notes again, but his hands trembled. He mumbled about fairness, about giving Diego a chance, but his argument wilted under the weight of Blackwell's smirk. Richard Blackwell rose once more, his polished shoes echoing as he stepped forward. "Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. This boy had neither the resources nor the education to develop such advanced methods independently. Harrington Prep nurtures the brightest minds, and yet he would have us believe he solved in weeks what our best scholars spent years refining. This is not genius, it is theft." His words cut like steel. Diego stared at the polished wood of the table, his chest heavy. He wanted to fight, to speak, but the room felt like it was pressing down on him, smothering his voice. His lawyer's silence only deepened the sense of abandonment. From the benches, whispers rose again. A woman in pearls shook her head, whispering that boys like Diego shouldn't even be allowed in competitions meant for real scholars. A man in a sharp gray suit muttered that poor families were always looking for shortcuts, that integrity couldn't be expected from them. Each murmur stung, though none of the voices said his name. Diego's eyes drifted to the empty seat beside him, the one his mother should have filled. He pictured her pushing a mop across a marble floor, her back aching, her knees sore, too afraid to lose her job to be here. He remembered the nights when she would press a sandwich into his hands and whisper, "Study hard, mijo. One day, numbers will carry you further than I ever could." He had believed her. Now, her faith felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The judge's gavel tapped once, demanding silence. She looked at Diego. "Do you understand the seriousness of these charges, young man?" Her eyes were steady, not unkind, but not sympathetic either. Diego forced himself to nod. His voice caught in his throat before he managed a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." The room fell quiet again. The boy looked impossibly small at that table, his future hanging on words he hadn't yet spoken. He clasped his hands together under the table, fingers interlacing so tightly his knuckles ached. The plaintiff's lawyers exchanged confident glances, certain they were moments away from crushing him. Kevin Dawson leaned in, whispering something about staying calm, but even his voice lacked conviction. And so Diego sat there, alone, under the weight of accusation, shame, and fear. He felt the eyes of strangers burning into him. He felt the shadow of Blackwell looming. And he felt, with painful clarity, that no one in this room truly believed him. Not yet. Richard Blackwell's voice carried through the courtroom with the precision of a knife. He rose to his full height, smoothed the lapel of his tailored suit, and stepped toward the center of the room as if he owned it. His assistants unfolded charts in bound volumes, laying them neatly on a polished table so the jury could see the logos stamped in bold. Harrington Preparatory Academy. "Your Honor," Blackwell began, his tone heavy with feigned regret. "What we are witnessing here is not the triumph of talent, but the corruption of integrity. The accused, young Diego Morales, is no prodigy. He is a fraud. He stole from the very institution that has built its name on intellectual excellence, and now he parades another man's work as his own." The words rang out with calculated gravity. Each syllable seemed to tighten the noose Blackwell imagined around Diego's future. He gestured to the evidence in front of him, diagrams filled with symbols, proofs, and annotations. "These are the results of years of research by Harrington Prep's top scholars, supported by millions of dollars in funding." And yet, he paused, his eyes narrowing on Diego, this boy, from a family with no resources, no library, no access, no proper tutors, would have us believe he reached the same results on his own. "It defies reason," the audience murmured in agreement. Parents of Harrington Prep students, draped in expensive coats and jewelry, whispered among themselves. A man in the back muttered that the boy's win had humiliated the school's name. Another scoffed, saying it was obvious the kid must have cheated. A mother leaned toward her teenage son and whispered, "See, that's why discipline matters. These street kids think shortcuts will make them special." The boy snickered. Diego clenched his fists under the table. His face burned with humiliation, but he forced his voice forward. "I didn't steal anything," he said, louder than he intended. His voice cracked, but the words were steady. "I worked on that solution for months. It's mine. I can show you how I did it." The courtroom did not quiet. Instead, his declaration was drowned by Blackwell's derisive laugh. "You see, Your Honor," Blackwell said smoothly, turning to the judge, "the arrogance of youth. He thinks persistence excuses theft. He believes raising his voice makes his story true. But mathematics does not lie. His so-called solution mirrors ours too closely to be coincidence. He had help, he had access, or he cheated. Either way, he is guilty." Kevin Dawson, Diego's lawyer, stood up and tried to object, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, my client," Blackwell's voice rolled right over him. "Your Honor, we cannot allow sentiment to blind us to fact. If this boy is allowed to get away with this, what message are we sending? That the work of scholars can be stolen without consequence? That a child from the streets can waltz in and mock the labor of an institution with centuries of legacy?" The murmurs grew louder, and Diego's words were swallowed again. Judge Holloway raised a hand, signaling for silence. Her expression was firm, though her eyes flicked toward Diego with a hint of concern. "Mr. Morales," she said evenly, "you will have your opportunity to explain. For now, remain quiet while counsel presents their argument." Diego sank back into his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. The words he wanted to say stuck in his throat. He had rehearsed them in his mind 100 times, how he had discovered the method step by step, how the formulas had come to him during long nights of trial and error, but none of that mattered when he wasn't allowed to speak. Blackwell seized the silence like a gift. He motioned for one of his assistants, who carried forward a sleek folder. Inside was a stack of glossy photographs showing Diego at the math competition. One captured him standing beside his poster board. Another showed the judges leaning in, visibly impressed. Blackwell laid them out for the jury. "This," he declared, pointing to the images, "is how he deceived the world." He stood before an audience of educators, of students, of reporters, and claimed these ideas as his own. He accepted their applause. He basked in the attention, and yet he knew, deep down, that the foundation of his work did not belong to him. A ripple of disapproval spread through the benches. The same parents who once whispered doubts now muttered openly, their voices like daggers aimed at Diego's back. "Shameless," one woman hissed. "Imagine raising a boy who would lie to win." Another added, "His mother should be ashamed." Diego's throat burned. He wanted to cry out that his mother was working at that very moment, scrubbing bathrooms to pay their rent. She had begged her supervisor for a few hours off to attend, but had been denied. She had promised she would try to come later, but for now, she wasn't there to defend him. Kevin Dawson shuffled his notes, finally standing to protest. "Your Honor, my client is a 14-year-old boy from a hardworking family. He has never even set foot inside Harrington Prep. The suggestion that he somehow stole documents from them is absurd. There is no evidence linking him to their research." Blackwell didn't even flinch. "Absurd?" He turned back to the jury, his voice dripping with contempt. "Or convenient? He had motive he wanted to win. He had opportunity. The competition rules required schools to share their problem sets in advance, and leaks happen. And he had execution. His so-called original solution mirrors ours too closely to deny." He paused dramatically, letting the accusation settle like a stain on the air. Then he looked straight at Diego, his eyes cold. "And let us not forget, brilliance without resources is a fantasy. No child solves such problems in a cramped apartment with no textbooks, no tutors, no support. Unless, of course, he cheated." The words hit Diego like stones. Diego's breathing quickened as every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. He felt pinned in place, like a butterfly trapped beneath glass. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to sit up straighter. "I didn't cheat," he said, his voice breaking but determined. "I solved it myself. I can explain how I did it, if someone will just listen." The room erupted in low murmurs again. Some scoffed, others chuckled under their breath. To them, the protest sounded like desperation, not truth. Blackwell smirked, spreading his arms as if to say, "You see?" Kevin Dawson placed a hand on Diego's arm. "Not yet," he whispered. But Diego shook his head. He couldn't stay silent while the walls closed in around him. Judge Holloway rapped her gavel once. "Quiet. Mr. Morales, this is not your turn to speak. You will remain seated until you are called upon." Diego swallowed hard. The reprimand stung, but what stung more was the disbelief in her voice. Even the judge sounded unconvinced. Blackwell stepped forward once more, seizing the moment. "Your Honor, the arrogance of this boy is astounding. He interrupts proceedings as though he owns the floor. If his defense is this reckless, how much more reckless must his so-called scholarship be? Harrington Prep's reputation has been smeared by this charade. We cannot allow it to continue unchecked." The privileged parents nodded in agreement. Some whispered harshly about Diego's background, making it clear they believed poverty and dishonesty were two sides of the same coin. "Poor kids always find ways to cut corners," one man muttered. Another said, "He wants sympathy, not justice." Diego felt his ears burn. Every cruel word pressed against him. But he thought of his mother. He thought of the nights she returned from work, exhausted, forcing a smile as she encouraged him to keep studying. She had believed in him when no one else did. He clenched his fists, repeating silently to himself, "I didn't steal it. I didn't." Kevin Dawson rose once more, his voice firmer this time, though still lacking the authority Blackwell commanded. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that Diego developed his work independently. He will demonstrate his process. He is not a thief. He is a student, a child, and yet he is being treated as though he were some master criminal." Blackwell scoffed audibly. "A child? Genius is not a defense against dishonesty. His age makes this crime even more insidious because it invites pity, but pity has no place in justice." The gavel came down again. Judge Holloway looked directly at Diego. Her expression was unreadable, her voice cool and measured. "Young man, Do you understand the seriousness of the charges against you? Diego's lips parted, his breath shaky. He nodded once, then forced himself to whisper, "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom went silent. A boy's future now teetered on the edge of belief and doubt. The courtroom hung in silence after Diego's whisper. He had said yes to the judge, yes to understanding charges that threatened to strip away his future. The air was heavy with the finality of it, with the sense that the verdict had already been written in invisible ink across the judge's bench. Blackwell leaned back with smug satisfaction, certain the battle was already his. Then the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway beyond the courtroom doors. Slow, steady, firm, the kind of footsteps that did not rush, but carried a weight of certainty. The heavy doors swung open, heads turned, conversations hushed into stunned silence. Through the doorway stepped a man in a dark blazer and plain black boots, his hair slightly tousled, his expression calm but resolute. It was Keanu Reeves. Gasps rippled through the room. A woman in the audience clutched her pearls. A teenager jabbed his elbow into his father's side, whispering, "Is that really him?" Reporters, already on edge for scandal, scrambled to take in what they were seeing. Blackwell's confident smile flickered, then faltered. Keanu walked down the aisle with quiet authority. He didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the shock that followed him like a shadow. He simply moved forward, his gaze fixed on the boy at the defendant's table. Diego's head lifted slowly, his eyes widening in disbelief. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. The movie star he had seen on posters and screens was here, in this courtroom, walking toward him. His chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from something that felt like hope breaking through a storm. Keanu reached the table. Without a word, he placed a steady hand on Diego's trembling shoulder. The boy's shaking eased, just slightly, under the quiet reassurance of the gesture. Then Keanu turned toward Judge Holloway. His voice, calm and grounded, carried across the room. "Your Honor, my name is Keanu Reeves. I am here today with the crossed road, permission of Diego Morales' mother to act as his advocate in these proceedings." The judge blinked, taken aback. "Mr. Reeves, this is highly unusual. On what grounds are you entering this case?" Keanu pulled a folded document from inside his blazer. "On the grounds of guardianship authorization," he replied. His mother, unable to attend due to her work obligations, signed this letter permitting me to assist her son in her place. I am not here as a celebrity, Your Honor. I am here as a man who believes in justice. Whispers filled the room again, louder this time. People leaned forward, trying to see the paper. Blackwell shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection. This is absurd. This man has no legal training. He cannot simply walk into a courtroom and insert himself." Judge Holloway studied the paper in her hands. The silence stretched. Then she looked up, her voice even. "The authorization is valid. Mr. Reeves may remain at the defendant's table as an advocate." The courtroom erupted in noise the moment Judge Holloway's words left her lips. Gasps, murmurs, and incredulous whispers filled the air. Some laughed in disbelief. Others craned their necks to get a better view of Keanu, as if they couldn't quite believe he was standing in the middle of such an ordinary courtroom, fighting for a boy no one else wanted to believe. Reporters scribbled frantically, one of them muttering that tomorrow's headlines had just written themselves. Parents from Harrington Prep exchanged looks of outrage, their polished faces twisted with disdain. To them, this was nothing more than a stunt. Richard Blackwell slammed his palm against the plaintiff's table. "This is a mockery of justice," he barked. His voice, once smooth and commanding, now carried an edge of desperation. "Your Honor, we cannot allow an actor to parade into this courtroom and derail a serious case with theatrics." Keanu turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Blackwell's with quiet steadiness. There was no anger in his gaze, only calm. "I didn't come here for theatrics," he said softly, but the words carried with surprising force. "I came here because a boy is being crushed under the weight of power and money, and because someone needs to stand beside him." The audience hushed again, unsettled by the sincerity in his tone. Diego sat frozen, staring at the man who had just stepped into his corner. For the first time since the trial began, he didn't feel completely alone. He felt a strange calm beginning to replace the panic, like someone had finally pulled him back from the edge of drowning. Judge Holloway rapped her gavel again. "Order. This is still my courtroom. Mr. Reeves, I will allow your presence, but you will remember you are not a licensed attorney. You may act as support, nothing more. Is that clear?" Keanu inclined his head respectfully. "Perfectly clear, Your Honor," Blackwell sneered, pacing in front of the jury. "Support? That's what we're calling this? What message are we sending, that a celebrity's presence matters more than evidence? That the word of an actor outweighs the law?" He spread his arms, appealing to the jurors' sense of outrage. "This is disgraceful." Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned toward Diego, lowering his voice so only the boy could hear. "You're not alone anymore. Look at me. They can say what they want, but I believe you. And together, we're going to make them listen." Diego swallowed hard, his throat tight, but he managed a small nod. The weight pressing against him seemed lighter with those words. The courtroom, though still restless, began to shift in mood. People couldn't quite dismiss Keanu's presence, no matter how hard Blackwell tried to downplay it. Something about the calm way he carried himself, about the quiet conviction in his words, disrupted the certainty that had filled the room only minutes before. For the first time, doubt crept into the faces of those who had already judged Diego guilty. Blackwell adjusted his tie with a flick of irritation. The disruption unsettled him, and though he tried to mask it with confidence, his jaw tightened as he faced the jury again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rising with theatrical flourish, "do not be distracted. This is still a case of theft. This is still a matter of facts and evidence, not sentiment and celebrity endorsements. Let us not confuse admiration with justice." But his words no longer carried the same command. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, some glancing toward Keanu, who remained seated with quiet composure, his hand still resting gently on Diego's shoulder. The gesture wasn't showmanship, it was steady, unshaken support. Judge Holloway's gaze flicked between the two men. "Mr. Blackwell, you will continue your argument in due time. For now, the defendant has been granted an advocate, and this court will proceed as ordered." Blackwell pressed his lips together, suppressing the retort burning on his tongue. He gave a stiff nod and retreated to his seat. The momentary silence felt heavy. Then all eyes turned once more to Keanu. His presence was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced before. He wasn't loud, he wasn't demanding, and yet every movement drew attention. When he finally spoke again, his words were measured. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "I understand my role here is limited, but I ask only one thing, that this boy be truly heard, not dismissed, not silenced. He has a voice, and it deserves to be recognized in this room as much as any lawyer's or institution's." The judge studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod. "Noted, Mr. Reeves. The proceedings will continue tomorrow with witness testimony. Until then, court is adjourned." Her gavel struck, sharp and final. The crowd erupted again, this time with overlapping tones of outrage, disbelief, and fascination. Some muttered that Keanu's presence was an insult to the judicial process. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, Diego wasn't the villain he had been painted to be. Reporters swarmed toward the aisle, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Diego sat motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He turned slowly to Keanu, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you here?" Keanu looked at him with steady eyes. "Because no one deserves to fight alone." The boy's throat tightened. For weeks, he had carried the weight of accusation and ridicule. For weeks, he had felt invisible, powerless. Now, for the first time, he believed that maybe the truth still had a chance. As the bailiff called for order and the courtroom emptied, the whispers lingered. The case was no longer just a boy against a school. It had become something bigger, and no one, not even Richard Blackwell, knew what would unfold next. The next morning, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Word of Keanu Reeves' sudden appearance had spread overnight, and by dawn, reporters and curious onlookers lined the courthouse steps. Inside, every seat was filled, the atmosphere buzzing with anticipation. This was no longer just a trial about a boy accused of cheating. It was now a spectacle with a movie star at its center. When Judge Holloway entered, the gavel struck sharply, demanding order. "This is still a court of law," she said firmly, silencing the restless crowd. "We will not treat it as theater." "Mr. Reeves, you may proceed." Keanu stood, his posture steady, his voice calm yet powerful enough to reach the farthest bench. "Your Honor, I came here yesterday not to draw attention to myself, but because I read about this case in the paper. A boy, 14 years old, accused of stealing brilliance." A boy who, from everything I saw, reminded me of myself. The courtroom stilled. Cameras stopped clicking. Keanu's words held weight, not because they were loud, but because they were honest. "I know what it is to come from hardship," he continued. "I know what it is to be dismissed, to be told you don't belong, to have to fight twice as hard just to be seen as equal. I read about Diego Morales, and I could not ignore him. His story reached me because I have walked parts of that road myself." Diego's eyes widened. He had expected Keanu to speak of justice, maybe of fairness, but not of his own past. The thought that this man, admired around the world, would compare himself to him made Diego's chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in weeks. "Hope," Blackwell snorted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Mr. Reeves is spinning tales about his childhood to win sympathy. He is an actor after all. Is this really what our court has come to? Trading facts for theatrics?" Keanu did not react with anger. He simply reached into his folder and produced a neatly folded document. He stepped forward, handing it respectfully to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Holloway. "This," Keanu said evenly, "is a signed authorization from Diego's mother, Maria Morales. She works 2 jobs to provide for her son. She could not be here because her employer denied her time off. She gave me permission to act as her son's advocate. This is not theatrics, Mr. Blackwell. This is responsibility." The judge studied the paper for a long moment before nodding. "The authorization is legitimate and will stand. Mr. Reeves may continue." The audience erupted in murmurs again. But this time, the tone was different. Some were impressed by the formality of the document. Others were unsettled by Keanu's quiet persistence. Diego looked up at him, his voice barely audible. "You know my name." Keanu gave the faintest smile. "Yes, Diego, and I believe in you." Blackwell rose slowly, his face tight with restrained anger. "Your Honor, this cannot be permitted to continue unchecked. This man is a professional actor. He thrives on stories. He thrives on public sympathy. And now he has inserted himself into a trial of real consequence, not a movie script. He is not here for justice, he is here for headlines." The words carried venom, but Keanu didn't flinch. He turned calmly toward Blackwell, his voice still steady. "Headlines? Do you think I wanted this attention? I live quietly. I came here because I saw a boy drowning in a system that would rather silence him than hear him. I came because Diego's mother begged for help and no one listened. You call that a headline? I call it a duty." The audience stirred. Even some who had sneered yesterday now shifted uncomfortably. His sincerity made Blackwell's accusations feel hollow. Keanu faced the jury next. "Diego's mother trusted me to stand in her place, not because I'm famous, but because she knew I wouldn't let her son be trampled. Look at him. He is 14 years old, accused of theft without evidence. They want to break him before he's even had the chance to prove who he islanded. That is why I'm here." Diego's throat tightened. He tried to hold himself together, but hearing those words cracked something inside him. For weeks, he had been treated as a liar, a fraud, a thief. Now, for the first time, someone powerful stood beside him and said out loud what he had been screaming silently all along, that he deserved to be heard. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Mr. Reeves, Your words are compelling, but this case will be decided on law, not sentiment. Keanu nodded. Of course, Your Honor, but fairness and law cannot live apart. If we silence the truth of a boy because he lacks money or influence, then the law serves only those who already have power. Blackwell rolled his eyes dramatically, spreading his arms toward the jury. And here we are, ladies and gentlemen, being lectured by an actor about fairness. Shall we also consult poets and singers before we decide verdicts? Mr. Reeves, your fame buys you respect in theaters, not in courts of law. Keanu's response was measured, almost gentle. Respect is not bought, Mr. Blackwell. It is earned, and I have no intention of earning yours. I am here for one person only, for Diego. If that bothers you, perhaps it is because your case relies more on crushing a boy's spirit than proving his guilt. A murmur of approval rippled through the benches, faint but undeniable. Reporters scribbled faster, their pens racing to capture every word. Blackwell stiffened, realizing the narrative was beginning to slip from his grip. Diego looked at Keanu, stunned. This was not performance. This was not spectacle. It was the first time in weeks someone had spoken the truth with enough strength to make the walls of this courtroom shake. Judge Holloway tapped her gavel once, restoring silence. Her eyes lingered on Keanu for a long moment, weighing the unusualness of the situation against the legitimacy of the documents he had provided. Finally, she spoke with calm authority. The authorization from Mrs. Morales is valid. Mr. Reeves may act as advocate for the defendant within the boundaries I set. That is final. Blackwell's jaw tightened. His polished confidence, once unshakable, now showed cracks. He leaned toward his team, whispering harshly, his knuckles white against the plaintiff's table. Keanu returned to his seat beside Diego. He placed the folded papers carefully back into his folder, then rested his hand lightly on the boy's shoulder again. You are not alone, he said quietly. I promised your mother I would not let them bury you in here. We'll get through this together. Diego blinked back the sting of tears. He had told himself for weeks that no one cared, that no one would stand for him. Now, the words "we'll get through this" echoed in his chest like a lifeline. The judge turned to the jury. We will continue with the text. Plaintiff's argument tomorrow. Until then, this court is adjourned. She struck her gavel, and the sound reverberated like thunder. Immediately, the courtroom exploded in voices. Reporters rushed toward the aisle, calling Keanu's name, flashing cameras. Parents from Harrington Prep hissed with anger, muttering that justice was being mocked. Others whispered in hushed tones, unsettled but intrigued. Blackwell stormed past, his glare burning holes in Keanu's calm expression. This is a circus, he snapped under his breath. You won't save him with your reputation. Keanu didn't rise to the bait. He only looked at Blackwell with steady eyes and said, We'll see. As the room slowly emptied, Diego stayed seated, still overwhelmed. He turned to Keanu at last, his voice trembling. Why me? Why would you care about someone like me? Keanu leaned forward, speaking so only Diego could hear. Because I've been where you are. Because I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong. And because your mother asked me to fight for you when she couldn't. The boy's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak, but the gratitude in his eyes said everything. Outside the courthouse, the noise of the press grew louder, waiting for a statement. But inside, at the defendant's table, a boy and a man sat quietly together. For the first time, Diego no longer felt like a fraud on trial. He felt like someone believed in him, and that changed everything. 3 months before the trial, Diego Morales' world was far simpler, though not any easier. He lived with his mother in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Los Angeles. The walls were thin, the paint peeling, and the window in Diego's room rattled each time a bus roared past on the street below. Their kitchen table doubled as his study desk, its surface marked with rings from old coffee cups and scratches from years of use. At night, when most of the city settled into sleep, Diego sat hunched over his notebooks, pencil moving furiously across the paper. The only light came from a cheap desk lamp they had found at a thrift store. Its bulb flickered sometimes, casting shadows across the page, but Diego hardly noticed. Numbers absorbed him. Patterns unfolded like stories, and equations felt like puzzles waiting to be unlocked. His mother, Elena Morales, moved quietly around him, often in her cleaning uniform. She worked nights at a downtown office building, vacuuming carpeted floors and scrubbing bathroom sinks. Her hands were rough from the chemicals, her knees often sore from hours of bending, but she never complained. When she looked at Diego bent over his papers, her exhaustion softened into pride. "Don't stay up too late, mijo," she would whisper, pressing a sandwich wrapped in foil beside him. "Brains need food, too." Diego would smile faintly, never lifting his eyes from the page. "Thanks, Mama. Just one more problem." He always said that just one more problem, but one problem became 5, and 5 became 10, until the night bled into morning. Elena sometimes returned from her shift to find him asleep at the table, cheek resting on equations scribbled across scrap paper. She would gently nudge him awake, guiding him toward his bed before she herself collapsed into sleep. At school, Diego's brilliance didn't earn him admiration. Harrington Prep students didn't know his name, but even in his modest public school, wealthier classmates looked at him with disdain. His clothes, bought from secondhand shops, were worn and sometimes mismatched. His sneakers were scuffed, the soles thinning. His lunches were simple homemade burritos wrapped in foil, or sandwiches on bread his mother bought in bulk when it was on sale. Some kids mocked him openly. "Hey, genius, did your mom pack you leftovers again?" They would snicker, pointing at his foil-wrapped burrito. Others rolled their eyes when he raised his hand in math class, muttering that he only answered to make everyone else look stupid. Diego pretended not to hear, but their words left marks. Still, he couldn't stop himself from solving problems. Numbers gave him confidence when people didn't. Equations treated him fairly when classmates didn't. He didn't care if his shoes were worn, or if his lunch didn't look like theirs. What mattered was the way patterns in mathematics made sense, even when the rest of the world didn't. One Friday afternoon, Diego sat in the back of his math classroom while his teacher, Mr. Patel, scribbled equations on the whiteboard. Most students doodled in their notebooks or whispered to each other, uninterested. But Diego's eyes never left the symbols. His mind raced ahead of the lesson, solving steps before Mr. Patel even wrote them. When the teacher posed a question to the class, silence filled the room. No one wanted to try. Diego's hand lifted hesitantly. Mr. Patel nodded, and Diego stood, explaining his answer with quiet certainty. His solution flowed across the board in clear, deliberate strokes. Mr. Patel raised his eyebrows in surprise. "That's not only correct," he said. "It's a method I haven't seen in years. Very clever, Diego." The praise should have felt good, but it only drew snickers from the back row. "Teacher's pet," one boy muttered. "Show off," another whispered. The word stung, though Diego kept his face neutral. He returned to his seat, gripping his pencil tightly. At lunch that day, Diego sat alone under the shade of a tree, unwrapping his burrito. He heard laughter from a nearby table where several boys mocked his answer from class, mimicking his voice in exaggerated tones. He stared down at his food, willing himself not to react. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made it worse. Later that night, when Elena returned from work, she found him at the table again, notebooks spread wide. She noticed his shoulders slumped lower than usual. "Rough day?" she asked softly. Diego hesitated before nodding. "They don't like me, Mama. They think I'm weird because of the way I talk about numbers." Elena cupped his chin gently, lifting his face. "Mijo, people fear what they don't understand. You have a gift. Don't let their laughter make you hide it." Her words steadied him, but the ache lingered. Diego longed for a place where he could be himself without ridicule. Somewhere his love for mathematics would be seen as strength, not strangeness. Weeks later, Mr. Patel pulled him aside after class. "Diego, I've been watching you. You're working on a level far beyond your classmates. I think you should enter the state math competition." It's challenging, but I believe you can do it." Diego's eyes widened. "Me? But I don't have the resources those other kids have." Mr. Patel smiled warmly. "You have something they don't: originality. You don't just memorize solutions, you create them. That is far rarer." The idea filled Diego with equal parts excitement and fear. Compete against the best students in the state? Students from schools like Harrington Prep? He wasn't sure he belonged in that world. But that night, while Elena packed her cleaning supplies, Diego told her about the opportunity. Her tired eyes lit up. "You must try, Diego. This could open doors for you. We'll find a way to make it work." And so, with nothing more than a thrift store calculator, scrap paper, and boundless determination, Diego began preparing for the challenge that would change his life. The weeks leading up to the competition became a blur of late nights and early mornings. Diego filled notebook after notebook with scribbled equations, diagrams, and half-finished thoughts that sometimes blossomed into breakthroughs. His lamp flickered constantly, but he ignored the shadows it cast. He had learned to see through the darkness. At school, however, his isolation deepened. When classmates discovered he had been chosen to represent their district, the teasing turned sharper. "You? Compete with Harrington Prep?" one girl sneered. "They'll eat you alive," another laughed openly. "Better not embarrass us, Morales. You'll make the whole school look pathetic." Diego tried to push the words aside, but they clung to him like burrs. He reminded himself of Mr. Patel's encouragement, of his mother's pride, but doubts crept in anyway. Could he really stand against students with private tutors, endless resources, and schools that treated math like a sport? At home, Elena worked harder than ever, picking up extra shifts to save for travel expenses. She didn't say it out loud, but Diego noticed the growing shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders drooped when she thought he wasn't looking. Still, she never let him see defeat. Instead, she pressed kisses to his forehead and whispered, "Keep going, mijo. You carry both of us in those numbers." The night before the competition, Diego sat staring at his notes, his pencil unmoving. Fear gnawed at him. What if they were right? What if he failed? What if all his mother's sacrifices amounted to nothing? Elena noticed his silence. She sat beside him, taking his hand into her rough, tired palms. "Diego, listen to me. Winning or losing doesn't define you. What matters is that you try, that you show them your light. Do you understand?" His throat tightened, but he nodded. Her faith steadied him when his own faltered. The next morning, he walked into the competition hall carrying only his backpack and a battered calculator. The room was filled with polished uniforms, shining shoes, and expensive graphing tools. Students from schools like Harrington Prep clustered together, laughing confidently. Diego kept to himself, clutching his notes, reminding himself of his mother's words. When his name was announced, the whispers started. "That's the janitor's kid," someone muttered. "He won't last around." Diego stepped forward anyway, his heart pounding but his hands steady as he laid out his work. He didn't look at the judges, the students, or the sneering parents. He focused on the numbers, the patterns, the quiet rhythm of solving problems. For those few minutes, the world fell away, and it was just him and the equations. The morning after the competition, Mr. Patel pulled Diego aside in the hallway. His normally calm expression carried a spark of excitement. "Diego, I want you to come by after school today," he said. "I have something I'd like you to try." Diego hesitated, worried he had done something wrong, but Mr. Patel's reassuring nod eased him. After the last bell, he walked into the classroom to find a stack of advanced math problems waiting on the desk. They weren't from the standard curriculum. They were pages filled with complex symbols, problems usually reserved for college students. "These are optional," Mr. Patel explained. "No grades, no pressure. I just want to see how you think." Diego sat down, pencil in hand, and studied the first problem. It looked impossible at first glance, yet within minutes, his mind began unraveling its threads. He didn't just apply formulas. He broke apart the problem, reshaped it, and found a path no textbook had taught him. His pencil scratched furiously across the paper, creating diagrams and shortcuts. When he finished, He slid the paper back toward his teacher, uncertain. "I don't know if that's right." Mr. Patel leaned over, scanning the page. His eyes widened. "Not only is it right, Diego, it's original. You didn't just solve it. You created a method I haven't seen in years." Diego blinked in surprise. "But I just followed the numbers." "That, Mr. Patel said with a smile, "is what makes you special." From then on, the teacher gave Diego extra problems each week, pushing him further and further beyond the limits of the curriculum. Each time, Diego found a new way to approach them, his methods messy but brilliant. He began to fill entire notebooks with equations, diagrams, and theories of his own making. One evening, while flipping through Diego's work, Mr. Patel stopped at a page filled with scribbles. At first it looked chaotic, but then he recognized the pattern. Diego was inching toward a theorem that simplified a notoriously complex proof. It wasn't polished, but the raw potential stunned him. "This," Mr. Patel said, tapping the page, "could change how people approach this problem. Do you realize what you've done?" Diego shrugged, embarrassed. "I was just trying to make it easier to see." "That instinct," Mr. Patel said, his voice firm, "is exactly why you need to compete again. The state competition isn't just about solving problems, it's about showing the world how you think. You have something rare, Diego. Don't hide it." The idea terrified him, but something inside him stirred at the thought. A chance to prove he wasn't just the poor boy others mocked, but someone whose mind mattered. Mr. Patel's encouragement gave Diego the courage to refine his discovery. For the next 2 weeks, he carried his notebook everywhere, scribbling during bus rides, jotting ideas while waiting in the cafeteria line, even sketching diagrams on the back of grocery receipts when inspiration struck. The theorem consumed him, not out of pressure, but out of joy. Each line brought him closer to a solution that felt entirely his own. When he finally presented the polished version to Mr. Patel, the teacher's eyes shone with pride. "Diego, this is the kind of work that wins competitions. More than that, it's the kind of work that shows the world who you are." Diego's heart swelled. For once, he could imagine a future bigger than the small apartment and the endless hours of watching his mother clean. He could imagine doors opening, college, scholarships, maybe even a chance to give his mother the rest she deserved. But as his confidence grew, so did the whispers from outside. Harrington Prep students had caught wind of his progress. At a district study session, where representatives from multiple schools gathered to prepare for the competition, Diego felt their eyes on him. One boy in a pristine blazer leaned over to his friend and said loudly enough for Diego to hear, "That's the Morales kid, the one from the public school. They say he came up with some new theorem." His friend laughed, as if he probably copied it from somewhere online. "Look at his shoes. You think someone like that is rewriting mathematics?" The comments stung sharper than usual because they struck at his deepest fear that no matter how hard he worked, people would always assume brilliance couldn't come from him. He lowered his gaze, gripping his pencil tightly to hide the tremor in his hands. When he told Mr. Patel about the encounter, the teacher's expression hardened. "Diego, people who feel threatened always try to tear others down. Don't let their jealousy rewrite your truth." Diego nodded, but the doubt lingered. At home, Elena noticed the weight on his shoulders. She placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. "Mijo, let them talk. Numbers don't care if you're rich or poor. They only care if you're right. And you are right." Her words steadied him. That night, Diego stayed up later than ever, fine-tuning his presentation for the competition. He didn't care if Harrington Prep sneered at his thrift store clothes or laughed at his second-hand shoes. When he stood before the judges, it wouldn't be about appearances. It would be about the gift inside him, a gift no one could take away. And so, Diego prepared to step into the spotlight, unaware that his brilliance would spark jealousy powerful enough to drag him into the courtroom months later. The day of the state math competition arrived with a crisp morning sky. Diego clutched his worn backpack as he and Mr. Patel stepped into the massive auditorium where the event was held. The hall buzzed with voices, the polished chatter of students from the finest private academies. Booths lined the floor, each decorated with gleaming displays, glossy poster boards, and expensive digital models. Diego's own setup was far humbler. His poster board was plain, its diagrams hand-drawn with a ruler and black marker. His notes were carefully organized, but lacked the flashy presentation others carried. Still, when he arranged his work neatly on the table, he felt a quiet pride. Every line, every proof, every diagram was his. Students from Harrington Prep occupied the row across from him. Their uniforms were crisp, their shoes spotless, and their equipment looked like it belonged in a professional laboratory. One boy glanced at Diego's setup and smirked. "That's it? Looks like a middle school project." Another laughed. "He probably copied it from a book. Just wait until the judges see what real talent looks like." Diego swallowed hard but said nothing. He focused instead on adjusting his diagrams, making sure each step of his theorem was visible. He reminded himself of his mother's words, "Numbers don't care if you're rich or poor." When the judges finally arrived, Diego's nerves surged. 3 professors from the state university approached his booth, their clipboards ready. They asked him to explain his project. Diego drew a breath and began. At first his voice trembled, but as he walked them through his theorem, confidence grew. He explained how he had discovered a way to simplify a notoriously complex problem, how he had connected principles from different branches of mathematics to form a shortcut that was both elegant and practical. The professors leaned in, their brows furrowing, not with skepticism, but with intrigue. One of them asked him to demonstrate on the board. Diego picked up the marker, his hand steady now, and worked through the solution, step by step. His method was clear, his reasoning precise. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then one professor whispered, almost to himself, "Remarkable." Another nodded. "I've never seen it approached this way. It's original, and it works." The third judge scribbled notes rapidly, his expression serious but impressed. "Young man, this is outstanding work." Diego's heart hammered in his chest. For the first time, he saw belief in their eyes, not doubt. Across the hall, whispers began to ripple. Parents and students from Harrington Prep exchanged uneasy glances. "That can't be his own work," one mother muttered. "There's no way a boy like him discovered something like that." But no matter how loudly they whispered, the judge's astonishment spoke louder. As Diego stepped back from the board, his chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He had shown the judges everything he had worked for, every late-night scribble and erased mistake. Now, all he could do was wait. The professors exchanged murmurs, flipping through his notes and diagrams. They asked questions, sharp, technical ones, but Diego answered each calmly. His explanations weren't rehearsed. They were born from countless hours of working alone, guided by instinct and persistence. When the judges moved on to the next booth, a wave of relief washed over him, but almost immediately, the sting of whispers returned. A boy from Harrington Prep leaned toward his teammate. "Did you see the judges? They're buying it. They actually think he came up with that himself." His teammate smirked. "They'll figure it out. There's no way. Kids like him don't invent theorems, they steal them." Diego clenched his fists, but kept his gaze fixed on his table. If he reacted, they would win. If he stayed quiet, the math would speak louder. By afternoon, the auditorium buzzed with restless energy. Presentations ended, and the crowd gathered near the stage for the award ceremony. Rows of gleaming trophies stood at the edge, catching the overhead lights. Elena had managed to get time off and slipped into the audience. She wore her cleaning uniform still, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, exhaustion etched into her face. But when her eyes found Diego, pride lit them with warmth. She sat quietly, unnoticed among the polished families, but her presence steadied him. The announcer stepped up to the microphone. "We are proud to honor the finest young mathematicians in the state. This year's competition has shown us ingenuity, dedication, and brilliance." The third-place award went to a polished project from a suburban academy. The second-place trophy was claimed by Harrington Prep, their team bowing confidently as cameras flashed. Then came first place. The announcer smiled, pausing for effect. "And this year's top honor goes to Diego Morales. For a moment, Diego thought he had misheard. His body froze, his mind blank. Then applause erupted, loud and scattered at first, then swelling as the professors themselves stood to clap. Elena's hands flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. She clapped furiously, her shoulders shaking with pride. Diego walked to the stage, legs trembling, as the announcer handed him the large trophy. It gleamed under the lights, heavy in his hands. He had done it. He had proven himself. But not everyone was clapping. In the rows of Harrington Prep parents, whispers cut through the applause like knives. "Impossible," one woman hissed. "He had help. He must have cheated." The accusations hadn't been spoken to the judges yet, but Diego could feel them circling like storm clouds, waiting for a chance to break. The applause faded as the winners posed for photographs. Diego stood awkwardly, clutching the trophy as flashes from cameras blinded him. Reporters scribbled in, their notepads, circling him as if he were a curiosity. One of them leaned forward, microphone in hand. "Diego, how does it feel to be the son of a janitor who just outsmarted Harrington Prep?" The words struck him harder than he expected. It wasn't just about his victory. It was about where he came from. He cleared his throat, answering softly, "It feels good to show that hard work matters, no matter where you're from." The reporter nodded, scribbling quickly. The next morning, a headline splashed across the local paper. "Janitor's son outsmarts elite academy." The article praised his originality, highlighting how his theorem stunned the judges. To many, it was an inspiring story of talent rising from humble roots, but to others, it was an insult. Parents at Harrington Prep seethed. In their circles, whispers grew louder. "No way this boy discovered something their brightest couldn't. He must have stolen it." That night, back in their apartment, Elena placed the newspaper on the table beside Diego's trophy. She traced the words with her fingers, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mijo, look at this. They see you. They see what I've always known." Her pride radiated, but beneath it, a shadow of fear lingered. She turned her face away for a moment, wiping her eyes. "The world doesn't like when someone from our place rises too high. Promise me you'll be careful." Diego tilted his head, confused. "Careful of what, Mama?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. He could feel her shoulders trembling, pride and fear intertwined in her embrace, as if she already sensed the storm that was coming. For Diego, though, the night felt like a dream. He placed the trophy on the small shelf above his bed, its golden surface gleaming against the cracked paint of their wall. As he drifted to sleep, he imagined doors opening, opportunities waiting. He had no idea that envy and resentment were already gathering force outside those walls, preparing to drag him into a battle far larger than any equation he had ever solved. The victory at the state competition brought Diego a week of wonder. Teachers congratulated him, neighbors smiled with admiration, and Elena carried the newspaper clipping in her purse, showing it to anyone who would pause long enough to look. For a short time, the world seemed brighter. But brightness fades quickly when envy grows in the shadows. One Thursday afternoon, just as the sun began to set behind their apartment building, a knock rattled the thin door. Elena, still in her cleaning uniform, wiped her hands on a rag before opening it. Standing there was a man in a pressed gray suit, a leather briefcase at his side. His expression was cold, detached, the kind that belonged to someone who delivered bad news for a living. "Elena Morales?" he asked. She nodded cautiously. He handed her a thick envelope. "You've been served. Harrington Preparatory Academy is filing a lawsuit against your son, Diego Morales, for theft of intellectual property. Damages sought. $1 million. Elena froze, staring at the papers as though they were written in another language. "$1 million?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man gave a curt nod. "Failure to respond will result in default judgment. I suggest you seek legal counsel." Without another word, he turned and disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the hum of the city. Inside, Elena sank into the worn couch, her hands shaking as she tore open the envelope. Legal terms blurred before her eyes: allegations, damages, property rights. All she understood was the number printed boldly: $1 million. It was more money than she could ever imagine. More than 100 years of scrubbing floors would earn her. Diego emerged from his small room, sensing the tension. "Mama, what's wrong?" She looked up, tears brimming. "Mijo, they're saying you stole it. Harrington Prep is suing us. They want money we don't have." Diego felt his stomach drop. He sat beside her, scanning the papers. Words like fraudulent representation and proprietary methods leapt out at him. His chest tightened. "But I didn't steal anything," he whispered. "It was mine." Elena pulled him close, pressing her forehead against his. "I know, Diego. I know. But these people, they don't care about truth. They care about power." For the first time since the competition, Diego felt the thrill of victory dissolve into despair. The trophy on his shelf seemed to mock him now, its gleam a reminder of the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. That night, Elena called every number she could find for legal aid, but most turned her away. One office said politely, "We can't take cases of this magnitude without a retainer." Another told her bluntly, "Against Harrington Prep? Impossible. Find another solution." By midnight, she sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, the unpaid bills already stacked too high beside her. $1 million lawsuit was not just impossible, it was unthinkable. Diego tried to reassure her. "Mama, maybe it'll go away. Maybe if we explain, they'll understand." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Harrington Prep didn't want explanations. They wanted to crush him, to erase the humiliation of losing to a boy with thrift store clothes and a homemade burrito in his lunchbox. And somewhere deep down, Diego felt the first heavy weight of hopelessness settle over his shoulders. The next morning, the news spread like wildfire. At school, Diego could feel the difference before he even reached his locker. Whispers followed him down the hallway, sharp and cruel, like invisible stones thrown at his back. "That's the kid who stole from Harrington Prep," someone muttered. "I knew it," another voice said. "No way he came up with that theorem on his own." By lunchtime, the stares were unbearable. He sat at a corner table with his foil-wrapped burrito, but even there, the noise reached him. Students who had once congratulated him now avoided his gaze. Some laughed openly, mimicking the way he explained math at the competition. A few sneered, "Fraud." Diego kept his head down, his appetite gone. He wanted to shout, to tell them the truth, but what good would it do? The lawsuit had given their whispers power. It no longer mattered what he knew, it mattered what they believed. When he walked into math class, the silence was deafening. Even Mr. Patel's warm smile could not erase the sting of his classmates' suspicion. A boy in the back raised his voice, just loud enough to be heard. Guess Patel handed him the answers. Laughter followed, though it sounded hollow to Diego's ears. After class, Mr. Patel pulled him aside. "Diego, don't listen to them. I've seen your work. I know the truth." But Diego only shook his head. What if truth doesn't matter? His voice cracked, heavy with despair. That evening, at home, Elena tried to keep strong. She cooked beans and rice, the scent filling the small apartment, but her hands trembled as she set the plates on the table. She looked at Diego, her voice barely steady. "We'll fight this, mijo, somehow." Diego nodded, though inside he felt the crushing weight of reality. They couldn't afford a real lawyer. They could barely afford rent. A lawsuit like this wasn't a fight. It was a death sentence, written in legal ink. He looked at the trophy on the shelf. It no longer glowed with victory. It looked like evidence, like the very weapon being used against him. Later that night, as Elena prepared for her night shift, Diego sat at the table with the lawsuit papers spread before him. The words blurred under his eyes. Proprietary methods, intellectual property, damages, fraud. Each line felt like a chain tightening around him. He pressed his forehead to the papers, whispering to himself, "I didn't steal it. I didn't." But the empty room gave no answer. When Elena left for work, she paused at the door. her eyes heavy with worry. "Hold on, Diego. Don't give up. You're my son. You're stronger than this." Diego forced a smile, but the moment the door closed, his shoulders slumped. The apartment felt too quiet, too heavy. His dreams of mathematics, once full of light, now felt like shadows pressing him into the ground. The world that had celebrated him just days ago now called him a fraud. And deep inside, Diego feared that no matter how hard he tried, no one would ever believe him again. The courtroom had returned to its heavy rhythm. Papers rustled, pens scratched against notepads, and the air seemed charged with the unspoken verdict already leaning against Diego. On the plaintiff's side, Richard Blackwell stood tall, his confidence sharpened like a blade. He gestured toward a large easel holding technical diagrams, pages filled with dense equations and geometric structures. Assistants moved quickly, displaying enlarged charts that bore the Harrington Prep crest at the corner. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Blackwell declared, his voice booming with practiced authority, "here you see the heart of our claim. This is the proprietary research of Harrington Preparatory Academy. Note the symmetry of the structure, the sequence of the formulas, the very language of the solution. Now compare it," he tapped the next chart with his pointer, "to what young Mr. Morales submitted at the state competition. Line by line, nearly identical. Coincidence? Impossible." The jury leaned forward, studying the charts. Some nodded, others narrowed their eyes. The similarities were undeniable on the surface. Diego sat frozen, his throat dry. He wanted to protest, to explain how he had reached his solution step by step, but the courtroom was no longer his. His lawyer, Kevin Dawson, fumbled with his notes, flipping through papers that seemed thinner and weaker than Blackwell's thick binders. "Your Honor," Kevin began nervously, We believe that Diego's work was original. His voice trailed off as he struggled to find the right words. He pointed weakly at Diego's notebook, sitting on the table, filled with months of scribbles. "He has records of his work, notes that show his process." Blackwell smirked. "Notes scribbled after the fact, perhaps? Convenient evidence, easy to fabricate once our methods were known. Do not be fooled by scraps of paper. Trust the integrity of an institution that has cultivated excellence for generations." The words hit their mark. Members of the jury exchanged glances. Some looked at Diego with doubt, others with pity. Kevin stammered again, his defense collapsing in the shadow of Blackwell's performance. Diego clenched his fists under the table. His heartbeat roared in his ears. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. They didn't believe him. They never would. Then, just as Blackwell was preparing his final flourish, another voice cut through the noise. Calm, steady, unhurried. "Your Honor," Keanu Reeves said, rising slowly from his chair. He adjusted his blazer, his expression calm but resolute. "May I show the court another side of this story?" The room stilled instantly. Reporters raised their pens, ready. The audience shifted, some leaning forward with sudden interest. Judge Holloway regarded him with a measured gaze. "Mr. Reeves, you understand you are not here as an attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor," Keanu replied. "I am here as an advocate for Diego Morales, with the permission of his mother. I do not claim legal expertise. What I offer is context, truth, and evidence that speaks to this boy's character and his work." Blackwell scoffed audibly. "Objection. This is unorthodox. We cannot allow." The judge silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. "Mr. Reeves has been granted authorization. He will be heard." And with that, the tide of the courtroom shifted, ever so slightly. Keanu stepped toward the front of the courtroom, his presence calm but commanding. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he let silence settle for a beat before he spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "Mr. Blackwell has shown us charts, diagrams, and equations," Keanu began, his gaze moving across the jury. "On the surface, they may look the same. Numbers often do. A solution in mathematics may wear many coats but still be the same truth underneath. But what matters here is not the code, it is the path taken to reach it." He gestured gently toward Diego's notebook on the defense table. This boy, Diego, did not wake up one morning with Harrington Prep's diagrams in his hands. He filled those pages over months of work. Scribbles, erasures, messy diagrams, ideas that failed before they succeeded. That is not theft. That is creation. That is the process of a mind learning to see patterns where others see walls. The jury shifted, some leaning closer. A woman in the front row tilted her head, intrigued. Blackwell rose, exasperated. "Your Honor, this is philosophy, not evidence." Keanu turned toward him calmly. "Evidence is not only in polished charts, Mr. Blackwell. It is in the story those charts don't tell. You present perfection as proof. But perfection is suspicious when it arrives without struggle. Diego's work is imperfect, and that imperfection is its proof of authenticity." Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow, considering the point. Keanu continued, his tone quiet but unwavering. "You say brilliance cannot come from a boy with thrift store clothes and a mother who works 2 jobs, but brilliance does not ask permission before it appears. It does not check your bank account before it lands in your mind. It can come in a mansion, yes, but it can also come in a 1-bedroom apartment where a boy studies by the flicker of a cheap lamp while his mother cleans offices at night." The room grew hushed. Even the reporters lowered their pens for a moment. Listening, Diego stared at Keanu, stunned. No one had ever defended him with such strength, not even himself. Blackwell clenched his jaw, but Keanu pressed on. "This case is not only about equations. It is about whether we believe genius belongs only to the privileged, or whether we admit that greatness can rise from the humblest home. Diego Morales is not a thief. He is proof that talent can bloom anywhere." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. The jury exchanged glances again, the doubt in their eyes now mixed with something else, curiosity, even respect. Judge Holloway tapped her gavel lightly. "Mr. Reeves, you've made your point for now. We will allow further exploration of the defense's evidence tomorrow." Keanu inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." He returned to his seat, resting a steady hand once more on Diego's shoulder. Diego breathed out slowly, the crushing weight on his chest easing for the first time. The courtroom still teetered against him, but now there was a shift, faint yet undeniable. For the first time, the jury wasn't looking only at charts. They were looking at him. The next morning, the courtroom filled again. The jury settled into their seats, their faces guarded but watchful. Reporters adjusted their cameras, eager for what was promised to be the most emotional day yet. Judge Holloway struck her gavel once. "The defense may proceed with its witnesses." Keanu rose from his chair, buttoning his blazer. He carried no stack of binders, no glossy exhibits, only a folder with a few papers and the steady confidence of someone who believed the truth could stand on its own. "Your Honor, I would like to call our first witness, Mr. Rajesh Patel." The bailiff led Diego's math teacher to the stand. Mr. Patel adjusted his glasses nervously as he raised his hand to swear the oath. Once seated, Keanu stepped forward, his voice calm but direct. "Mr. Patel, how long have you known Diego Morales?" "Since he was 11 years old," Patel replied. "I have been his math teacher for 3 years." "And in that time, what did you observe about his abilities?" Patel leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Diego has an unusual brilliance. He doesn't just memorize formulas, he creates methods of his own. I began giving him problems far beyond his grade level. He solved them with approaches I hadn't taught. In fact, some were approaches I had never even seen before." Blackwell stood quickly. "Objection. Teachers often exaggerate the talents of their students. That hardly proves originality." Judge Holloway gave him a sharp look. "Overruled." "Continue, Mr. Reeves." Keanu nodded. "Mr. Patel, did you keep any record of Diego's work?" Patel smiled faintly. "I did. I saved copies of his notebooks, his diagrams, his rough drafts. They show his thought process, messy, imperfect, but genuine. No thief works like that." The jury leaned forward as Patel held up a folder thick with photocopies. pages filled with half-erased lines, arrows pointing in different directions, scribbled equations that eventually resolved into polished solutions. Keanu let the moment hang, then asked softly, "In your professional opinion, is Diego capable of creating the work that Harrington Prep accuses him of stealing?" Patel's voice was firm now. "Yes, absolutely. He is one of the most gifted students I have ever taught." The jury scribbled notes. Even Judge Holloway's eyes softened slightly. When Patel stepped down, Keanu called the next witness. The defense calls Ana Martinez. A girl in Diego's class approached nervously, twisting her hands as she walked. She swore the oath and sat, glancing at Diego with a shy smile. Keanu's voice gentled. "Ana, how long have you known Diego?" "Since elementary school," she said. "We've been in the same math classes. And what have you observed about him?" Ana hesitated, then answered, "He's different. In a good way. He solves problems no one else can. Sometimes even the teacher has to check twice because Diego's answers are so unexpected. I've seen him stay after school, filling page after page with numbers. None of us could ever keep up." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. For the first time, Diego saw the jury's eyes soften, not with doubt or pity, but with recognition of his humanity. Ana's words hung in the quarter. Air, fragile but honest. Keanu gave her a reassuring nod before asking, "Ana, in all the time you've known Diego, did you ever see him cheat?" Her head shook firmly. "Never. He doesn't need to. Math is like breathing for him. I used to joke that he could solve problems in his sleep. He just sees things the rest of us don't." The jurors leaned in, some with faint smiles, as if reminded of a child they once knew who had a spark of genius. Blackwell rose swiftly. "Miss Martinez, students are loyal to their friends. Isn't it possible you're exaggerating? Isn't it possible Diego copied something without you realizing?" Ana looked flustered, but her voice held. "No, I saw him do it. I saw him figure things out that nobody else could. He didn't copy. He created." Her certainty struck harder than any polished rebuttal. Blackwell frowned but sat down, his pen tapping sharply against his notes. Keanu let Ana step down, then glanced at Diego. The boy's eyes glistened, gratitude written all over his face. For once, someone his own age had defended him in front of the world. "The defense calls Elena Morales," Keanu said next. The room grew quiet as Diego's mother approached the stand. She still wore her work uniform, her shoes worn from hours of standing, her hands raw from cleaning supplies. She raised her trembling right hand to swear the oath. When she sat, Keanu's voice softened. "Mrs. Morales, could you tell the jury what you've seen of your son's work at home?" Elena swallowed hard. "I come home from work late, sometimes after midnight, and I always find him at the kitchen table, piles of papers everywhere. He works until his eyes can barely stay open. I tell him to sleep, but he always says, 'Just one more problem, Mama.'" Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. "He writes on everything, scraps of paper, napkins, even the back of grocery lists. He can't stop. Numbers live in his head, and they don't. Let him rest." Tears welled in her eyes as she clasped her hands together. "I scrub floors so my son can have a chance. I can't give him tutors or expensive schools, but I can give him belief. And I know, deep in my heart, that what he created came from him, not from anyone else." The courtroom was silent. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably, visibly moved. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Even Judge Holloway's expression softened. Just for a moment. Blackwell stood slowly, his tone careful. "Mrs. Morales, you love your son. Isn't it possible your love blinds you to the truth?" Elena's voice steadied, iron beneath the tremor. "Love doesn't blind me. Love lets me see clearly. And I see my son for who he is. A boy with a gift that frightens people who think only the rich can be brilliant." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the room. Keanu let the silence linger, then nodded respectfully. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Elena stepped down, Diego's eyes brimmed with tears. For the first time, He felt the jury looking at him, not as a fraud, but as a son, as a boy who carried the weight of his mother's dreams and sacrifices. And in that moment, the tide began to turn. The jury's expressions had softened after Elena's testimony. For the first time since the trial began, there was a flicker of humanity in their eyes. Diego could feel it too, like a small light breaking through the gloom. But Richard Blackwell was not a man who surrendered easily. He rose from his chair with deliberate calm, his face composed but his eyes glinting with something sharp. He cleared his throat, pacing toward the jury with a confidence that had not wavered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone smooth and measured, "the defense has told you touching stories. You have heard about late nights at the kitchen table, about notebooks filled with scribbles. Very moving, I'm sure. But sentiment does not erase suspicion. Sentiment does not answer the question, how could a boy like Diego Morales have known the methods Harrington Prep spent years developing?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. Then he gestured to his assistant, who handed him a slim folder. Blackwell opened it slowly, deliberately, as though unveiling a hidden truth. "What the defense has failed to mention," he continued, "is the history of Diego Morales' own family. His late father, Miguel Morales, once worked as a janitor at Harrington Prep." The words struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted from the benches. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking like a storm of shutters. The jury leaned forward, eyes widening in shock. Diego's heart dropped into his stomach. His chest tightened, and for a moment he could not breathe. His father's name spoken here, in this place, in this way, felt like a wound ripped open. Blackwell's voice grew sharper, sensing the shift. "Yes, Miguel Morales, a man with access to our buildings, our offices, and yes, our files. A man who had opportunity to see confidential research. Are we to believe it is merely coincidence that his son has now presented work eerily similar to our proprietary methods?" Elena covered her mouth with her hand, trembling. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from grief, but from shame. Shame that the name of the man who had abandoned them was now being used to stain her son. Diego's fists clenched under the table, his nails digging into his palms. His father had left years ago, disappearing without a word. He had lived his whole life trying not to be defined by that absence, trying to build something of his own. Now, Blackwell had dragged his father's ghost into the courtroom, chaining Diego to a past he wanted nothing to do with. Keanu leaned closer to Diego, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Don't let him break you," he whispered. But the boy's eyes were wet, his face pale. Blackwell turned back to the jury, his tone triumphant. "This is not a fairy tale of a poor boy's genius. This is the legacy of theft. Secrets stolen by a janitor, passed down to his son, who now parades them as brilliance. It is not talent, it is inheritance of dishonesty." The words sliced through the courtroom. The fragile faith the jury had begun to build wavered again. And for Diego, hearing his father's name spoken as proof of guilt felt like the ground beneath him had given way. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike. The jury shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. Some wore expressions of doubt again, the fragile sympathy Elena's testimony had earned, now dissolving under Blackwell's revelation. Elena's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to shout, to tell them Miguel Morales had never cared enough to leave anything behind, let alone secrets. But her voice caught in her throat. The shame of his absence had followed her for years, and now it was being twisted into a weapon against her son. Diego stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The mention of his father reopened wounds he had buried deep. Miguel had walked out when Diego was only 6, leaving Elena to raise him. Alone, Diego had grown up telling himself he didn't need that man, that his absence would not define him. But now, in front of strangers who held his fate in their hands, his father's name was spoken like a curse. Blackwell sensed the power of the moment. He paced slowly, letting his words drip with calculated poison. The defense would have you believe Diego's gift came from thin air, but the truth is far less magical. His father had access to documents, to offices where confidential research was stored. We do not accuse Miguel Morales lightly, but it is clear that his son benefits from knowledge no ordinary child could possess. This is not genius. This is legacy. Gasps and murmurs swept the room again. A man in the gallery muttered, "Of course. It all makes sense now." Keanu rose instantly. His calm tone carried a sharp edge now. "Objection, Your Honor. There is no evidence, none, that Miguel Morales ever stole anything from Harrington Prep, nor that Diego inherited anything but his name. This is slander against a child, and against a family already carrying loss." Judge Holloway raised her hand, silencing the room. Her eyes narrowed at Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell, tread carefully. Unless you can present hard evidence, this line of argument is dangerously speculative." Blackwell bowed his head slightly, masking his satisfaction with false humility. "Of course, Your Honor. I only present the facts of employment history and the undeniable similarities in the work. The jury can draw their own conclusions. But the damage was done. Diego could feel it in the way the jurors avoided his eyes, their sympathy clouded by suspicion. He whispered, almost to himself, "I'm not him. I'm not my father." Keanu leaned close, his voice firm. "They need to hear that, Diego. Not from me, from you. When the time comes, you tell them." Diego's throat tightened. The thought of speaking terrified him, but the fire of humiliation burned too hot to gay. "Stay silent, forever." Blackwell returned to his seat, a satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. He had taken the trial, twisted it, and anchored it to a ghost Diego had tried to forget. The gavel struck once more, calling for order, but the courtroom's mood had shifted again. Hope had faltered, and suspicion crept back in. And as Diego sat there, trembling under the weight of his father's shadow, he realized that the fight ahead was no longer just about math or theorems. It was about breaking free from a past that others wanted to chain to his future. The courtroom still buzzed with the echo of Blackwell's accusation. The jury sat stiffly, caught between sympathy and suspicion, and Diego lowered his head, his face pale with shame. The air felt poisoned with his father's name, twisted into evidence against him. Then Keanu stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though the weight of what he carried needed careful handling. His face was steady, but in his eyes there was something different this time, something raw, almost vulnerable. "Your Honor," Keanu said, his voice low but firm, "I cannot remain silent. The plaintiff has raised the name of Miguel Morales. If the court will allow, I must share what I know." Judge Holloway studied him carefully, then gave a small nod. "You may proceed, Mr. Reeves, but be brief and remain within relevance." Keanu turned toward the jury, his hands clasped in front of him. He took a moment, letting silence settle until every ear strained for his next word. "Years ago," he began, "long before this trial, long before today, I was spending time volunteering quietly at community centers here in Los Angeles. I tried to keep it low profile, away from cameras and headlines. I just wanted to listen, to meet people, to understand their lives." The jury leaned in. Even the restless audience grew still. "It was at one of those centers that I met a man named Miguel Morales," Keanu continued. "He was tired, his clothes worn from work, but he carried himself with dignity. He told me he worked at Harrington Prep as a janitor. He didn't speak of himself much. What he did speak of, what lit up his entire face, was his son." Keanu's voice softened. "He told me his boy could see patterns in the stars. I remember those exact words. He said Diego wasn't like other kids. He didn't just memorize. He saw connections, like threads woven into the world itself. He said, 'One day, my son will solve problems that make grown men scratch their heads. He has something in him I can't explain.'" Gasps rippled through the benches. Diego's head jerked up, his eyes wide. He had never heard anyone speak of his father with pride. Keanu's throat tightened slightly, but he pressed on. "I never forgot that conversation. In fact, I wrote it down in a notebook I keep from those visits. I didn't know, until this case, that the boy Miguel spoke of that day was Diego. But when I saw Diego's name in the paper, accused of theft, I remembered his father's words. I remembered the light in his eyes when he spoke of his son's gift. Keanu paused, letting the memory settle over the courtroom. Diego's gift is real. It was spoken of long before Harrington Prep's accusations, long before this trial. It is not theft. It is not legacy of dishonesty. It is raw, untamed genius. A father who had little else still carried hope that his son's mind could touch the stars. The courtroom was utterly silent. For the first time, Blackwell looked unsettled, his lips pressed into a thin line. And for Diego, hearing those words was like a lifeline thrown across years of silence. His father had abandoned him, yes, but he had believed in him, too. Keanu let the silence linger for a moment before he continued. His voice grew steadier, stronger, carrying not only conviction, but something deeper, an ache, as if he too carried the scars of being doubted. I know what it is. Like, he said, his eyes sweeping across the jury, to be told you don't belong, to be dismissed because of where you came from, because of what you didn't have. Diego Morales is standing where I once stood, at the edge of disbelief, accused of being less than he island. I will not let you mistake his gift for dishonesty. He turned slightly, his gaze falling on Diego. The boy stared back at him, eyes glassy, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Keanu's voice softened. Your father may not have stayed, Diego, but he saw you. He knew. And I see you too. What you've done is not theft, it is proof of who you are. A murmur rippled through the benches, not the sharp whispers of suspicion, but the softer sound of people moved against their will. One juror dabbed her eyes. Another leaned back, exhaling as though a weight had lifted. Blackwell jumped to his feet, desperate to reclaim control. Your Honor, this is sentimental nonsense. Mr. Reeves is weaving fairy tales about janitors and stars. None of this is admissible as evidence. It is pure manipulation. Judge Holloway raised her gavel but didn't strike it. She regarded Keanu carefully. Mr. Reeves, you walk a fine line. I will allow this testimony because it speaks to the character of the defendant. But you must conclude. Keanu inclined his head respectfully. Yes, Your Honor. He turned back to the jury one final time. You have seen Harrington Prep's charts. You have heard accusations and suspicion. But I ask you to weigh something more powerful. Truth. Truth written not in perfect diagrams, but in the messy scribbles of a boy who could not stop thinking, who could not stop solving, who could not stop dreaming. Truth, spoken by a father who, years ago, described a child who could see patterns in the stars. That child is before you today. That gift is his, and his alone. He let the words hang in the stillness before returning to his seat. Diego could barely breathe. His chest ached, but for the first time in days, it was not from despair, it was from the flood of hope breaking inside him. He whispered, almost to himself, "He believed in me." Elena reached over, clutching his hand. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "And so do I." The jury sat in silence, their pens resting motionless on their pads. For the first time, suspicion seemed to waver not because of argument, but because of something deeper, something human. Blackwell sank back into his chair, fury flashing across his face. His carefully crafted case, built on cold logic and polished suspicion, now teetered against the raw power of memory, humanity, and truth. And in that moment, though the verdict was still far away, the balance of the courtroom had shifted. The next day, the tension inside the courtroom felt sharper than ever. Every seat was filled, reporters lined the walls, and the jury filed in with the weight of expectation on their shoulders. Judge Holloway called for order, her gavel echoing against the chamber walls. Keanu rose slowly from his seat. His calm demeanor held steady, but the folder in his hand seemed heavier than paper alone. He walked toward the center of the room, stopping just before the jury. "Your Honor," he said, his voice clear, "the defense would like to present evidence of Diego Morales' originality, drawn not from speculation, but from years of work." Arms folded across his chest. More bedtime stories? He muttered. But Keanu ignored him. He opened the folder and lifted out several worn, dog-eared notebooks, their covers frayed, pages bent from years of handling. He placed them gently on the evidence table. These are Diego's notebooks, dating back years before Harrington Prep's alleged research. They are filled with his handwriting, his equations, his diagrams. They show his process, not the polished perfection of an institution, but the messy, genuine path of a child teaching himself to think. The bailiff carried one of the notebooks to the judge, who flipped through it. Her brow furrowed as she studied pages scribbled with half-formed equations, erased attempts, and crude diagrams that gradually grew more sophisticated. She handed it toward the jury. One by one, the jurors leaned in to examine the evidence. "This," Keanu continued, "is what genius looks like in its rawest form. Imperfect, unpolished, chaotic at times, but real." He stepped closer, his eyes meeting each juror in turn. Harrington Prep claims these ideas could only come from them. But here you see Diego wrestling with numbers years before their polished research ever appeared. He didn't copy, he created. And every stroke of his pencil tells that story. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft turning of notebook pages. Reporters scribbled notes, capturing every word. Blackwell shot to his feet. "Your Honor, anyone could have manufactured these notebooks after the fact. They prove nothing." Keanu turned toward him, his voice calm but sharp. "Anyone, Mr. Blackwell? Do you truly believe a 14-year-old boy and his mother fabricated years of work with consistent handwriting, aged paper, and progression of thought that cannot be faked? Or is it easier for you to believe a lie than accept the truth that brilliance can live outside your walls of privilege?" Gasps rippled through the room. The judge silenced them with her gavel, but did not reprimand Keanu. He turned back to the jury, his voice rising now, carrying emotion that filled the chamber. Innovation is not the property of the privileged. Genius does not belong only to those with money, uniforms, and polished halls. Genius can live in the humblest home, in the hands of a boy who studies by a flickering lamp while his mother cleans offices to keep food on the table. Diego's chest tightened, his eyes shining. For the first time, the shame he carried felt like it was being lifted, replaced with dignity. The jurors listened, their faces no longer hardened with doubt. Something was shifting, something real. Keanu let the silence stretch before he spoke again, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. "Look closely at these notebooks. You'll see mistakes, revisions, crossed-out pages. That is the language of discovery. True theft leaves no errors, no hesitation. But Diego's work shows the slow, painful birth of ideas he nurtured on his own." He turned slightly, gesturing toward Diego, who sat trembling at the table. "This boy is not a thief. He is a pioneer in the making. And if we punish him for daring to think differently, what message do we send to every child who dreams that brilliance is only accepted if it comes wrapped in wealth? That a janitor's son cannot possibly create what a rich school claims as theirs?" His voice grew stronger, echoing against the wood-paneled walls. "If this jury condemns Diego Morales, you do not only silence him, you silence thousands of children like him. Children who might never raise their hands in class again, who might bury their talents in shame, because they learned that genius is punished when it comes from the wrong address." The audience sat spellbound. Some shifted in their seats, visibly moved. One juror dabbed at her eyes. Another leaned back, hands clasped, struggling to hide the emotion rising in his face. Keanu pressed on. "Diego's story is not just about numbers. It is about hope, about the belief that talent can rise anywhere." When his mother found him asleep over scraps of paper, when his teacher saw him solving problems no one else understood, those were not moments of theft. Those were moments of light. To punish that light now would not only break Diego, it would break the very idea of fairness. He paused, his voice catching just slightly before finishing. "Brilliance belongs to no class, no uniform, no academy. It belongs to the human spirit. and Diego Morales is living proof of that truth. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Richard Blackwell, who had thrived on his own theatrics, seemed momentarily at a loss. He shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. The jurors stared at the notebooks passed down their row, their fingers brushing the worn edges of the pages. They weren't just looking at numbers anymore. They were seeing the story of a boy who refused to stop dreaming, even when the world told him to quit. Tears slipped down Elena's face as she gripped the edge of the bench. Diego sat frozen, his chest rising and falling, his eyes fixed on Keanu. For the first time, he saw the possibility that the truth might win. And as the silence deepened, the weight of Keanu's words hung in the air like a verdict of their own, an unspoken call to justice that no one in the room could ignore. The courtroom sat in still silence after Keanu's speech, but the storm had not yet passed. Richard Blackwell straightened his tie, preparing to claw back control. He opened his mouth, but Keanu raised his hand slightly, signaling he had more to say. "Your Honor," Keanu began, his tone calm but steady. "In defending Diego, I've spoken about his originality. But we have also investigated Harrington Prep's so-called proprietary method. And what we found will shock this court." The room shifted, tension spiking. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Proceed, Mr. Reeves, but be certain of what you bring." Keanu turned to Kevin Dawson, Diego's appointed lawyer, who handed him a thick binder. Keanu carried it to the evidence table, his movements deliberate. "These documents," he said, placing the binder flat, "are copies of research published over 40 years ago by an immigrant mathematician named Dr. Emil Kovacs. He came to this country with nothing, worked odd jobs to survive, and spent his nights scribbling theories in a rented room above a laundromat. His work was ignored in his lifetime. He died poor, without recognition." He opened the binder, showing yellowed pages filled with equations typed on an old machine, margins annotated in careful handwriting. But what Harrington Prep claims as its own, the method they say Diego Morales stole, is already here in Dr. Kovacs's papers. Line by line, the resemblance is unmistakable. Gasps erupted in the benches. Reporters scrambled to capture the name, pens flying across their notepads. Keanu lifted a photocopy, holding it high for the jury to see. This was published in 1,981 inches, a small mathematics journal that fell into obscurity. Hardly anyone read it, but Harrington Prep did. They lifted his method, polished it, stamped their name on it, and locked it behind their crest of prestige. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Do you have proof of this claim?" "Yes, Your Honor," Keanu replied firmly. He gestured to the binder. "This includes certified copies from the archives of that journal, authenticated by the university library. They confirm that Harrington Prep's so-called innovation is not their own creation, but the work of a forgotten immigrant who never lived to see credit." The bailiff carried the binder to the judge, then to the jury. Pages turned, eyes widened, whispers spread. Keanu turned back to the courtroom, his voice rising now. "So let us ask, who are the true thieves here? A 14-year-old boy with notebooks of his own? Or an elite institution that took the brilliance of a man who died in obscurity and claimed it as their inheritance?" All eyes darted to Richard Blackwell. His confident mask cracked, his face paling as he shuffled his papers. This is a distraction," he stammered. "Outdated work from a fringe figure. It has nothing to do with this case." Keanu stepped closer, his eyes locked on Blackwell. "Nothing to do with this case? Then why do the equations match almost perfectly? Why does Harrington Prep's proprietary method carry the fingerprints of Dr. Kovacs's forgotten work?" The room buzzed louder now, the tide turning. The jury no longer looked at Diego with suspicion. They turned instead toward Blackwell and Harrington Prep, their expressions hardening. And for the first time, the accusers found themselves under accusation. The jury leaned over the binder, their fingers tracing the faded equations. The similarities were undeniable: structures, sequences, even the peculiar notations Dr. Kovacs had used. These were not coincidences. These were the bones of the very method Harrington Prep had paraded as its own. Judge Holloway closed the binder with deliberate care. Her gaze cut toward Blackwell, sharp as steel. "Mr. Blackwell, how does your institution explain this?" Blackwell rose, stiffly, his voice strained. "Your Honor, mathematics often leads to similar conclusions. Parallels between old and new work are inevitable." To suggest that Harrington Prep Keanu's voice cut cleanly through his protest. "Not parallels, Mr. Blackwell, copies. Even the phrasing of the theorem in Harrington Prep's documents mirrors Dr. Kovacs's unpublished drafts. It was not evolution, it was appropriation. And it was done in silence, leaving the true author buried in poverty while Harrington Prep built prestige on his back." The audience erupted in whispers. One juror shook his head, muttering to the others. A reporter scribbled furiously, mouthing, "This changes everything." Blackwell's composure faltered. Sweat beaded at his brow. He shuffled his papers, but no counterargument came. His silence was louder than any denial. Keanu pressed on, his voice steady but fierce. "The tragedy is not only that Harrington Prep stole, it is that they now accuse a child of doing exactly what they themselves are guilty of. They call Diego a thief, when the real theft was committed decades ago against a man who had no voice, no wealth, no advocates. That man was Dr. Emil Kovacs. And today, through Diego, his voice finally returns." Diego's eyes glistened as he stared at the binder. For the first time, the shadow of theft that haunted him began to lift. It wasn't his name that bore dishonor, it was theirs. Judge Holloway's tone was firm, her decision resolute. "Given this evidence, I am ordering an immediate investigation into Harrington Preparatory Academy's claims. Until this court determines otherwise, their so-called proprietary methods cannot be treated as original." Gasps filled the chamber. Reporters surged toward the aisle, whispering about headlines that would shatter Harrington Prep's reputation. Parents from the academy shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale. Blackwell sat down heavily, his earlier arrogance gone, his features drained of color. He avoided the jury's eyes, staring instead at the polished wood of the table as if it could swallow him whole. Keanu turned toward the jurors one last time. His voice softened, but its conviction did not waver. "Diego Morales is not a thief. He is a boy with a gift, fighting to be seen in a world that too often denies brilliance when it comes from unexpected places." Harrington Prep sought to break him, but in doing so, they revealed their own corruption. The truth has always been here, in Diego's notebooks, in his mother's sacrifices, in his teacher's testimony. And now, in the forgotten work of a man whose name deserves to be remembered. The courtroom fell into reverent silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The truth had struck, and its weight was undeniable. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation. Every breath felt suspended, every eye fixed on the bench where Judge Holloway sat with the binder of evidence closed before her. The gavel rested at her side, but its authority lingered in the silence that filled the room. She scanned the jury, then turned her attention to the crowded benches, her expression solemn. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented, including the testimony of witnesses, the notebooks of Diego Morales, and the documents concerning Dr. Emil Kovacs. What has come to light is not merely about one boy or one competition, but about truth and integrity." Her words cut through the room with quiet force. Harrington Preparatory Academy has accused Diego Morales of theft, yet the evidence reveals that the very foundation of their claim, the so-called proprietary method, was itself taken from the forgotten work of another. To punish this boy for the sins of others would not be justice. It would be injustice compounded. A murmur of agreement rippled across the benches, quickly hushed as she raised her hand for silence. "This court finds the defendant, Diego Morales, not guilty of all charges." The words rang like a bell. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen. Then, the sound of applause burst forth, echoing off the high ceilings. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, even some wiping tears from their eyes. Elena gasped, covering her mouth with both hands before rushing forward. The bailiff made no move to stop her as she threw her arms around her son. "You're free, mijo," she whispered. her voice breaking. "You're free." Diego clung to her, tears streaking down his cheeks. For weeks, he had carried the crushing weight of shame and fear. Now it lifted, leaving only the fierce warmth of his mother's embrace. Keanu stood back, watching quietly, his expression soft. He had fought fiercely for this moment, but he let it belong to them. The boy and his mother had carried enough shadows. Now they deserved light. But the storm of celebration did not end there. Reporters surged into the aisle, microphones raised, cameras flashing in a frenzy. Questions flew like arrows. "Mr. Reeves, why did you get involved in this case? What compelled you to defend a boy you barely knew? Was this about making a statement?" Keanu raised his hand gently, silencing the questions. He spoke softly, his words barely above a whisper, yet they carried through the room. "Because I was once that boy." The room quieted instantly. The weight of the words sank deep, even more powerful than any speech he had given before. Reporters scribbled furiously, their faces struck by the simplicity and gravity of his answer. Diego looked up at him, his tears still fresh. For the first time, he saw not just the actor, not just the advocate, but someone who understood the loneliness of being doubted, the pain of being underestimated. And in that moment, Diego realized he was no longer standing alone. The echo of Keanu's words lingered long after he had spoken them. "Because I was once that boy." It was not shouted, not wrapped in grandeur, but it struck with the weight of lived truth. Reporters froze in their frenzy, their microphones lowered as if out of respect. Parents who had once whispered against Diego shifted uneasily in their seats. Even members of the jury blinked back, the emotion rising in their eyes. Diego turned to Keanu, his voice trembling. You were like me?" Keanu crouched beside him so their eyes were level. "Yes, Diego, I know what it feels like to be dismissed, to feel invisible. But someone believed in me when I thought no one would. Now it's my turn to believe in you." Elena's tears flowed freely as she pulled both of them into her embrace. For the first time in years, the hollow ache of abandonment was replaced with something fuller, a circle of faith, a family bound not by blood, but by courage. "Judge." Holloway struck her gavel lightly, calling for order, but even her stern composure could not conceal the faint warmth in her expression. "This case is closed. Further investigation into Harrington Prep will proceed separately. Court is adjourned." The audience rose to their feet again, clapping until the chamber trembled. Cameras flashed as reporters rushed for statements, but the moment belonged not to them, not to Harrington Prep, not even to Keanu Reeves. It belonged to Diego Morales, the boy who had been branded a thief, but left the courtroom seen as what he truly was, a creator. As they stepped outside, sunlight poured over the courthouse steps. Reporters swarmed, microphones crowding, but Keanu shielded Diego and Elena, guiding them forward with calm authority.
"One question, Mr. Reeves," someone shouted.
"Do you see this as a victory over the system?" Keanu shook his head gently. "This isn't about victory. It's about fairness. A boy's life should never be destroyed because of where he comes from." Today, truth was louder than privilege. Diego held the trophy from the competition close to his chest, no longer a weight of accusation, but a symbol of resilience. Elena clasped his hand tightly, her pride no longer mingled with fear but shining clear and fierce. As they descended the steps, Diego whispered to Keanu, "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu smiled faintly. "Don't thank me. Just keep going. Keep solving. Keep dreaming. That will be thanks enough." The crowd parted before them, applause following as they walked. For Diego, every step felt different now. He was no longer the boy accused. He was the boy who endured, who proved that genius can rise from anywhere. And as Keanu guided him and his mother into the sunlight, his quiet words lingered in every ear that had heard them. "Because I was once that boy." The weeks after the trial unfolded like a new season of life for Diego Morales. The courtroom whispers that once followed him everywhere faded into the background, replaced by words of admiration and awe. Teachers treated him differently now, not with suspicion, but with respect. His classmates, who once mocked him, now watched him with hesitant curiosity, unsure how to approach the boy who had stood against one of the wealthiest schools in the state and won. But what mattered most was the change at home. The shadows that had hung over Elena's small apartment seemed to lift. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream without fear. She framed the newspaper headline that read, "Janitor's Son Vindicated in Courtroom Drama," and placed it above the shelf where Diego's trophy still stood. Only this time, the trophy no longer looked like a target for envy. It looked like a promise fulfilled. One crisp afternoon, a letter arrived in their mailbox. Diego tore it open, expecting another bill or notice. Instead, his eyes widened as he read the elegant script. A full scholarship offer from the Westbrook University Foundation. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. It was not from Harrington Prep, not from the institution that had tried to destroy him, but from a foundation dedicated to supporting underprivileged students with extraordinary potential. Elena read the letter over his shoulder, her hand flying to her mouth. "Diego, mijo, this is everything we prayed for." He could hardly speak. "Mama, I can go to college. I can really go." What Diego didn't know, at least not yet, was that the foundation's funding had been quietly supplemented by Keanu Reeves. He had insisted it remain a secret, not wanting credit. He simply wanted to give the boy a chance to walk through doors that had once been locked to him. A week later, Diego found himself standing nervously outside Keanu's home. It wasn't a mansion draped in excess, but a quiet place, warm and unpretentious. He clutched the scholarship letter in his hand, as if it might vanish. When Keanu opened the door, Diego blurted out, "Thank you." His voice cracked under the weight of the words. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." Keanu smiled gently, stepping aside to let him in. "You don't need to thank me, Diego. You earned this. All I did was remind the world to see what was already there." Diego's eyes brimmed with tears again. "But if you hadn't been there, they would have crushed me. I'll never forget what you did." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and grounding. "Listen to me. Your brilliance belongs to the world, not just to you. Use it with humility and compassion. Numbers are powerful, but it's what you do with them that will matter most." Those words etched themselves into Diego's heart, a compass pointing him toward the kind of man he wanted to become. The conversation with Keanu lingered in Diego's mind long after he left the quiet home. The world outside seemed brighter, the weight on his shoulders lighter. For years, he had been the boy mocked for his thrift store shoes, the boy whispered about in hallways, the boy accused of theft. But now, he was something different. He was a boy with a future. That night, Diego sat on the small balcony outside their apartment. The city hummed below, but above him, the sky stretched wide and full of stars. He spread his notebooks across his lap, the same worn ones that had once been questioned in court. His pencil moved quickly, sketching equations under the glow of the moon. Each line felt like a promise not just to himself, but to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Elena stepped quietly onto the balcony, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She set one beside him and leaned on the railing, watching him work. The light from the apartment spilled across her face, softening the lines of exhaustion that years of labor had etched. For the first time in so long, her smile was free of fear. "You're still at it," she said, her voice warm. Diego looked up, grinning faintly. "I can't stop, Mama. It feels like the numbers are finally mine again. Not theirs, not anyone else's, just mine." She brushed a hand over his hair. "They were always yours, mijo. The world just needed to see it." The two sat together in the quiet night, the bond between them stronger than any verdict could measure. Elena gazed at the stars, remembering the words Keanu had shared in court about patterns in the sky. She wondered if Miguel had really seen it all those years ago, if deep down he had known the gift his son carried. Whatever his failures, that truth could not be denied now. Days passed, and life began to settle into something resembling normal, though Diego's definition of normal had forever changed. He received letters from universities, invitations to programs, even notes from strangers who had read about him in the news. Some offered praise, others shared their own struggles of being overlooked. Diego read each one carefully, realizing that his story was no longer just his, it was hope for others. Through it all, Keanu kept his distance from the spotlight. He declined interviews, brushed aside praise, and refused to let the story center on him. But one afternoon, when Diego returned to thank him again, Keanu gave him a final piece of advice. "Diego, the world will try to put you in boxes. Too poor, too young, too different. Don't live by their labels. Live by your gift. And remember, humility will keep your genius human. Compassion will keep it good." Those words settled deep, like roots stretching into his soul. Weeks later, Diego stood at the university's orientation, a scholarship student among hundreds of others. He wore a new backpack, his notebooks tucked carefully inside. Elena stood at his side, tears in her eyes as she hugged him before he walked through the gates. "Make the world see you, mijo," she whispered. That night, back at the apartment, the balcony sat empty for the first time in years. But the stars above seemed brighter, as if watching over the boy who had once studied beneath their glow. Elena sat alone with her mug of hot chocolate, looking up at the sky. Pride swelled in her chest. Her son was no longer the boy accused, he was the boy who overcame. And somewhere across the city, Keanu Reeves sat quietly by his own window, staring at the same sky. He thought of the boy he once was, the one who longed for someone to stand beside him. And he thought of Diego Morales, who now carried his brilliance into a future that no one could steal. Would you stand up for someone the world tried to silence? Tell us in the comments below.